By the time I understood the notebooks were not meant to save anyone, the storm shelter was already filling with smoke. The shelves ran floor to ceiling in that concrete room. Thousands of swollen ranger books, stacked spine out in mildewed rows, each one labeled in a different hand, each one containing rules written with the calm certainty of dying people. I was feeding them to a steel drum with shaking arms, and every page that curled black made the air above the fire writhe like something breathing. The radio on the workbench kept turning itself on. First, it used my grandfather's voice, then Claire's, then mine. "Do not burn them," it said. "That only teaches it what hurts." Above me, something heavy moved through the cabin in a pattern that matched my heartbeat. One step, pause. 2 steps, pause. As if it were learning the rhythm. The storm hammered the hatch overhead. The metal buckled inward once, then again. And then a face appeared in the tiny wired glass window set into the shelter door. My face, older, hollow-cheeked, rain running down it like tears. He put one finger to his lips and mouthed, with terrible patience, "Too late." Then the knocking started from inside the walls. It started 3 nights before that. I inherited the cabin 6 weeks after my grandfather died, which was 6 weeks after I'd started sleeping in my car, and 3 weeks after my name began appearing in legal notices I avoided reading. His name had been Silas Mercer. Mine was Ethan. We had not spoken in 11 years. The executor called me because there was no one else. "You're listed specifically," the woman told me over the phone. The property and all materials on it passed to the next Mercer in line. Property suggested something civil, a house in town, maybe a condemned trailer, not a ranger station stranded in the middle of a national forest so remote that 3 separate map apps insisted it did not exist. I drove north in a borrowed truck with temporary plates and a duffel bag of clothes I hadn't paid for. The truck still smelled faintly of pine cleaner and dog hair. In the passenger seat sat a thick manila folder containing my grandfather's will, a forestry survey, and a hand-drawn route marked in blue pencil. The printed map showed an old service road terminating at a stream crossing, then a maintenance trail zigzagging higher into the mountains. GPS repeatedly tried to drag me elsewhere, rerouting me in slow, offended circles as though the truck itself were disobeying. By dusk, I was ready to give up and sleep at a trailhead. Then I saw the first marker. It had been nailed to a fir at shoulder height, a square of weathered aluminum, stamped with the initials SM, and a faint arrow scratched into the paint. 50 yards later, there was another, then another. No official trail signs, no blazes, just my grandfather's private breadcrumb line leading into darker timber. I followed them because I had nowhere better to go. The cabin appeared all at once through the trees, not picturesque and not small. It looked assembled over decades rather than built. One structure extended by another, roof lines crossing at bad angles, additions sitting on different foundations, like separate thoughts connected by hallway. A main cabin crouched at the center, under a sagging green roof. Behind it stood an observation tower, with narrow windows and a staircase, boxed in by old timber. Off to one side sat an equipment shed, with double doors and a chained fuel cage. Beyond that, on slightly higher ground, a fire lookout platform had been raised above the slope, a square deck with rails, silvered by weather. Half hidden by brush near the back was the storm shelter, its slanted metal hatch built into a mound of stone and packed dirt. The whole place had the self-sufficient ugliness of something made by practical men who assumed no one would ever visit. Still, it was bigger than anything I had expected, and intact enough to make my chest loosen for the first time in months. The key had been left under a flat rock on the porch, exactly where the executor said it would be. That bothered me a little, not because it was unsafe, but because it implied continuity, as if the cabin expected inheritors in a regular sequence. Inside, the main room smelled of old paper, dry wood, and trapped cold. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall. The furniture was plain, Ranger issue by the look of it. Hard-backed chairs, a scarred table, cabinets built from knotty pine. Someone had covered the windows with blackout curtains that snapped sharply when I tugged them aside. In the kitchen, every drawer was labeled in my grandfather's cramped blockhand. Batteries, filters, salt, nails. The place felt less abandoned than paused. An envelope lay in the middle of the table. It was addressed in typewriter capitals, "For the next Mercer." I remember smiling when I opened it, that stupid private smile a person wears when they think life has finally become manageable again. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "Lock all doors by sunset. Do not enter the tower after midnight. Ignore the lights between the trees. Never answer knocking after dark. If the radio activates by itself, switch it off immediately." That was all. No explanation. No signature. I read it twice, then laughed out loud in the empty room. My grandfather had spent 40 years as a forest ranger, posted in places where men went half feral, talking to weather and trees. The rules struck me as exactly the kind of mythology isolated people invent, so their habits feel important. Lock your doors. Don't go climbing stairs drunk at night. Don't answer to poachers or drifters. Turn off static on the radio before you start hearing things in it. Sensible survival advice, dressed up as family ritual. I folded the page and slid it into my pocket. By then, the light had gone yellow at the windows. I walked the property once before dark, checking hinges and padlocks, inventorying what I suddenly considered assets. 2 generators in the shed, 5 jerry cans of treated fuel, water tank uphill, dry goods enough for weeks, an old ham radio unit in the corner office attached to the main room, shelves of tools, cots in the tower and in a bunk room off the hall. Even the fire lookout platform had binoculars under a tarp. I locked the doors mostly because there were bears in the region, and I am not completely foolish. That first night, I slept in my clothes under a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Wind moved through the trees with a hollow ocean sound. Once, far off, I thought I saw a pale light pass between the trunks, but it vanished when I sat up. I told myself it was the truck battery of a lost hunter on some lower road. Before I went back to sleep, I noticed one thing that should have unsettled me more than it did. For a forest that large, there were no insect sounds, no crickets, no night birds, no rustling animals in the underbrush, only wind. At the time, I called it peace. The first 4 days were almost embarrassingly normal. After the first morning, I stopped thinking of myself as a fugitive and started thinking like a caretaker. That was how quickly comfort can rewrite a man. I got the smaller generator running, bled the line on the larger one, patched a leak in a sink pipe, and spent an entire afternoon in the equipment shed, making a list of what could be sold if things got worse down in the real world. There were old surveying instruments, spare copper wire, 2 chainsaws, weatherproof lanterns, sealed boxes of flares, and enough specialized gear that I briefly considered whether my grandfather had been stealing from the Forest Service for 30 years. The routines came easily. Coffee at dawn, walk the perimeter, check fuel, sweep the porch, eat from cans and rice, sit on the fire lookout platform toward evening, and pretend the silence below was chosen. The quiet never changed. That was the first truly wrong thing, though I refused to name it. No birds crossed the clearing. No squirrels raided the roofline. Once I stood in the yard and clapped hard just to see what would startle. Nothing answered. It was like living inside a paused recording of the wilderness instead of the wilderness itself. I found the first hidden note while looking for a can opener. It had been taped beneath the top kitchen drawer, folded into a square, and yellowed with age. The handwriting was not my grandfather's. Smaller, hurried. The tower rule only matters when you're alone. I stared at it for a moment, then laughed under my breath and tucked it into my pocket with the typed rules. There was something almost charming about it. as if generations of lonely caretakers had added marginalia to a family joke. The second note was wedged behind a panel in the radio desk. Do not trust the radio after rain. That one I didn't like as much. Not because it frightened me, but because it implied the rules were not fixed. If you're going to build folklore, at least build it cleanly. The third note turned up in the observation tower, under the mattress on the narrow cot. It had been crossed out so violently that the pencil had torn the paper. If you hear your own voice outside, stay inside. There was no signature there either. No date, just that sentence, cancelled as if whoever wrote it had later wanted it unwritten. I slept fine that night anyway. That was the shape of my confidence then. I kept finding odd things, and instead of growing wary, I became dismissive. Every contradiction made the whole system seem less meaningful. There's no faster way to lower your guard than to conclude the people before you were merely unstable. I began taking longer walks around the property. The trail network nearby wasn't official, just old footpaths and maintenance cuts, but it was enough to stretch my legs. On the second afternoon, I saw the figure. It stood at the tree line north of the clearing, half covered by trunks, too far away for detail. Human height, motionless. I lifted a hand to shade my eyes. Hello? No answer. I walked toward it at once, irritated rather than frightened. The ground dipped through fern and rock. I looked away for maybe 2 seconds, to avoid twisting an ankle, and when I raised my head, the figure was gone. There was nowhere to go that quickly. The trees were too dense. I did a slow circuit, feeling foolish. No tracks, no snapped branches, no sound. Back at the cabin, I decided it had been a dead snag or a trick of depth. Human beings are built to recognize bodies in vertical shapes. We see faces in wall stains and saints in toast. A dark tree with a pale strip of bark becomes a person if you're primed for stories. That night, I deliberately left one curtain open to prove I wasn't becoming one of them. Around midnight, I woke because I thought somebody had walked past the window. I sat up, listening. Nothing. No footfall, no voices, no knock. I crossed the room, looked out, and saw only the clearing washed in moonlight. The tower cast a long black bar across the ground. Beyond it, the trees stood in ranks like men waiting their turn. In the glass for half a second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me. I turned so fast that I struck the table with my knee. The room was empty. When I looked back, there was only my own reflection and the dark outside it. That should have been enough to humble me. Instead, I slept late the next morning and spent breakfast making fun of my grandfather to an empty chair. Lights in the woods, I said aloud, spooning peaches from a can. Mysterious knocking, evil tower hours. The sound of my own voice in that room carried oddly. It seemed to stop near the walls instead of fading. By the 5th day, the rules had become entertainment. I recited them while chopping wood. I saluted the radio when I passed. I stood at sunset with all the doors unlocked for a full minute, just because I could. Nothing came. Confidence is addictive when the world keeps rewarding it. On the evening of the 6th day, I saw the figure again. This time it was closer. Not close enough to identify, but close enough that I could tell it was not a tree. It stood just beyond the last line of stumps near the old service path, hands at its sides, head slightly cocked as if studying the cabin. I felt a brief flare of annoyance, the kind that comes when somebody watches your house from the road. I shouted, "If you need something, come ask for it." The figure did not move. Then a gust pushed through the clearing, and when the branches shifted, it was gone. I went back inside and wrote in my own notebook for the first time since arriving. Either someone's messing with the place, or this property attracts a very specific kind of idiot. I believed that, entirely, which is probably why it had already started learning from me. I broke the tower rule by accident, and for a long time, that accident felt like proof that all the others were nonsense too. The observation tower connected to the main cabin by an enclosed passage lined with old photographs and weather reports. Its stairwell smelled of dust and dried sap. At the top was a square room with windows on all sides, maps pinned to the walls, a narrow desk, and a cot tucked into the corner beneath a shelf of outdated fire logs. It was the best vantage point on the property by far. From up there, the clearing looked small and orderly, the rooflines of the outbuildings fitting together like a model. Beyond them stretched black timber, and ridge after ridge of mountain fading blue into the distance. I started using the tower in the evenings, because the light lingered longer there. On the 9th day, I carried up a thermos and one of the old ranger journals I'd been skimming mostly for practical details. The entries were boring in the way official records are boring. Water levels, fuel tallies, wind direction, mentions of trail washouts. I must have fallen asleep around 11 with the journal open on my chest. When I woke, the tower windows were silver with moonlight, and my neck ached from the angle of the cot. My watch read 1:53 a.m. For a moment, I just blinked, disoriented. Then I remembered the typed rule in my pocket. Do not enter the tower after midnight. I was not merely in the tower after midnight. I had been asleep there, alone, for almost 2 hours. I sat up and waited. Nothing happened. No voices on the stairs. No lights between the trees. No nausea. No hallucinations. No sense that I had crossed some invisible line. The tower was still the calmest place on the property. Below me, the clearing shone pale and empty. The main cabin windows reflected the moon. The forest stood motionless and mute. I laughed again, softer this time. Sorry, Silas, I muttered. Then I did something that seemed funny then and obscene now. I lay back down and went to sleep. I woke after sunrise feeling better rested than I had in months. That was the beginning of my stupidity becoming active instead of passive. Up until then, I had merely doubted the rules. After the tower night, I started testing them. I left the north door unlocked after sunset. Nothing. I stood on the fire platform and watched the tree line after dark when faint lights moved between trunks like distant lanterns or slow fireflies. Nothing. A knock came on the main cabin door the following night. 3 measured taps just after I'd finished eating. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, then smiled despite myself. The timing was almost theatrical. 3 more taps. I did not answer, but I also did not feel fear. That is important. I wanted understood that whatever intelligence lived around that cabin was patient enough to survive mockery, and intelligent enough not to punish it immediately. I waited for 10 minutes at the table. The knocking did not repeat. When I finally opened the curtain, the porch was empty. The old radio clicked to life on the 11th evening, while I was cleaning a rifle I had found in the locked cabinet by the hall. Static rolled through the room, then a burst of weather code, then more static. The typed rule said to switch it off immediately if it activated by itself. Instead, I let it play. I wanted proof of mechanism, loose wiring, faulty power, some natural explanation I could hold and laugh at. I even bent over the set and tapped the side as if I knew anything about radios. The static thinned into something like breath. I frowned, leaned closer, then told myself that was ridiculous. I adjusted the volume lower and went back to the table. After a minute, it clicked off on its own. That should have bothered me. It didn't. By the time the figure at the tree line had become almost familiar, I saw it every day, always a little closer, always at the edge of certainty. Once I thought it stood near the equipment shed, but when I walked over, the dirt showed no tracks beyond my own. Another time, I caught sight of it reflected in the tower glass before I saw it outside. I found that interesting in the detached way one finds a recurring dream interesting. My contempt for the rules reached its peak the afternoon I wrote my own version and pinned it to the wall over the stove. Don't panic. Don't mythologize old men. Don't mistake isolation for haunting. Fix what can be fixed. Sell everything else. I wish I could say I did that because I was brave. The truth is uglier and smaller. I did it because certainty felt good. and I had lost so much control over my life outside that cabin that disproving one little inherited superstition became a private narcotic. When the first consequence came, it did not feel like punishment for a broken rule. It felt like evidence that reality itself had been keeping notes on me. 3 nights after I slept in the tower, I woke at 3:14 a.m. because I heard someone walking around inside the cabin. Not outside, inside, slow steps. The quiet tread of boots on old floorboards moving through the kitchen, then the hall, then stopping just beyond my bedroom door. I sat up without breathing. The knob did not turn. After maybe 30 seconds, the steps continued, crossing away toward the main room. Then I heard the north door open and close. When I ran out with the rifle, the cabin was empty. The north door stood wide to the dark. Mud marked the floorboards. The prints were clear enough to show the wear pattern on the soles. They matched my boots exactly. Once I saw my own footprints leading out of my bedroom and back in again, all the false confidence I had built began falling apart, rather than all at once. That was the worst part. A clean terror can be survived. It gives you direction, but the cabin didn't offer anything so generous. It kept producing evidence that might have had ordinary explanations, if taken one at a time. A misplaced object, a draft, a remembered movement that maybe never happened. Each thing alone invited denial. Together, they created a pressure I could not escape, because each new sign made me reevaluate all the previous ones. I checked my boots first, stupidly hoping for some difference. Same size, same split in the right heel, same chevron worn smooth near the toe. I set them on the table and stared at them until dawn, as if they might confess. Nothing else looked disturbed. No missing food, no broken latch, no valuables gone, though that amused me bitterly because there were no valuables worth taking. By daylight, I convinced myself I had sleepwalked. Exhaustion can do strange things. Stress can do stranger. I had spent weeks lying to attorneys, clients, and myself before I came north. My nerves were not clean instruments. Then I found the notebook. It was tucked beneath the spare blanket on the cot in the tower, where I knew with absolute certainty it had not been the day before. Cheap black cover, my initials on the front in silver marker. I opened it, expecting one more relic from some previous mercer. The first page was in my handwriting. Not similar to mine. I know the lazy tail on my ways, the way my T's lean forward, the pressure I put on downstrokes when I'm irritated. Every line in that notebook belonged to me. The earliest entry described arriving at the cabin, not exactly as it happened, but near enough to turn my stomach. The next pages summarized the days I had already lived. Then the dates moved ahead. I stood in the tower with sweat under my arms despite the cold, and read an entry dated tomorrow. It said, Claire would come at 4:10 in the afternoon, wet to the knees, asking for dry socks before offering her name. I did not know any Claire. I kept reading. A storm is predicted for the following evening. A line about finding the hidden compartment under the shelter. A sentence about the radio using my voice before it gets better at yours. Then, halfway down a page, unfinished as if the writer had been interrupted, it learned my face after the tower. I closed the notebook so hard that the pages snapped. For an hour, I went methodically through explanations. I had written it myself and forgotten. Someone had watched me closely enough to imitate me. My grandfather, in some final act of spite or madness, had hired somebody to elaborate the joke. All of those explanations required impossible things, but they were still easier to hold than the alternative. At 4:10 that afternoon, someone knocked on the front door. 3 measured taps. I did not move at first. I simply looked at the clock on the stove, then at the black notebook on the table, then back at the door. A wet smell drifted faintly through the seams. Rain beginning outside, though the sky had been clear an hour earlier. Another 3 taps. I opened the inner shutter, but not the door. A woman stood on the porch in a Forest Service shell jacket darkened by rain. Mid-30s, maybe. brown hair plastered to her cheeks, mud to the knees exactly as the notebook had said. She looked exhausted rather than frightened. "I don't mean to impose," she said, "but I could really use dry socks." Then, after a beat, "Claire," my hands went cold so fast they hurt. I did not let her in. I remember her expression changing then, not to anger exactly, but to a hard understanding, as if my refusal confirmed something she had suspected about me before we met. "Right," she said quietly. "You found some version of the rules. Who are you?" "A surveyor." She glanced past me into the room. "Or I was before the roads stopped making sense. Depends on how technical you want to be." I shut the shutter in her face. "That sounds cruel." It was cruel, but by then, cruelty felt safer than politeness. I stood with my back to the door until the porch boards stopped creaking. When I finally looked outside again, she was gone. That night, the storm arrived exactly on schedule. Rain hammered the roof in hard, slanting sheets. The gutters overflowed within minutes. Lightning flashed behind the ridges without thunder at first, illuminating the clearing in negative. I sat at the table with the black notebook open and the radio unplugged. It turned on anyway, static, a hiss. Then my own voice, clear and close, speaking with the flat impatience I use when embarrassed. "Why did you let it see you?" Every muscle in my body locked. The voice repeated, slightly distorted. "Why did you let it see you?" I yanked the cord from the wall completely. The radio kept speaking. Tower was a mistake. The tower was how it measured you. "Ethan?" I backed away from the table until I struck the cabinet behind me. The voice softened into something almost sympathetic. "Ethan, if you hear yourself outside, stay inside." That was one of the crossed-out notes. I don't remember deciding to run. I only remember suddenly being in the hall with the rifle, every light in the cabin seeming too bright, every shadow having depth it had not possessed an hour earlier. In the glass of the back door, I saw movement and spun, but the movement was not behind me. It was in the reflection itself. A figure crossed the room there, ahead of where my body stood, as if the mirror were receiving events before they happened. I fired at the glass. The shot deafened me. The pane exploded outward. Rain blew in. From somewhere beyond the shattered door, in the storm, my own voice laughed once. Not mockingly, knowing. I spent the next morning pretending I was still a rational man. That is not the same thing as being rational. It is a performance assembled from familiar motions. Boiling water, sweeping broken glass, checking hinges, writing observations in clean lines to make them seem containable. My hands shook the entire time. I had wrapped the radio in a blanket and locked it in the pantry, as if cloth and pine boards could muffle whatever had learned to use it. The storm had not passed so much as paused. The sky hung low and green-gray over the ridges. Every surface outdoors shone wet. Mud covered the clearing in a way that should have made tracks obvious. There were none. Not Claire's from the porch. Not anyone's near the broken back door. Only the marks of my own boots, wandering from building to building in restless loops. The black notebook lay where I had left it. No new writing. No missing pages. That steadiness almost angered me more than if it had transformed in the night. The hidden compartment turned out not to be hidden at all once I knew to look. That detail shamed me. There are humiliations in horror that have nothing to do with fear, only with realizing how much you had failed to notice in plain sight. The storm shelter sat behind the main cabin under a berm of stone and root. Inside, the concrete room was lined with canned food, water drums, fuel tablets, and rusting emergency cots. At the back wall, a workbench had been bolted into the floor. Beneath it, concealed by a warped kick panel, was a shallow metal drawer with no handle. A pry bar opened it. Inside were folders, journals, laminated maps, and sheaves of typed pages tied in twine. Generations worth. Some of the materials bore Forest Service stamps dating back to the 1950s. Others were handwritten on notebook paper, grocery receipts, margins torn from topographic charts. There were rules typed on onion skin, rules scrawled in pencil, rules amended in red pen, rules with entire lines blacked out or circled with furious notes. They did not agree. One yellowed page read, "Stay in the tower after midnight. Do not allow the lights to gather below the windows. If it's a call from the radio, answer as your predecessor." Another, maybe 20 years newer, "Never remain below ground during storms. If there are footsteps overhead while in the shelter, count to 100 before emerging. Do not use your family name out loud after dark." One set referred only to watchers, another to returns, another to the remainder. One page simply read, over and over, in increasingly shaky handwriting. "It keeps the version that understands it." I sat on the shelter floor for what might have been an hour, reading until my eyes blurred. My grandfather's journal was the thickest. He had not written like a mystic. That was what made it worse. Silas recorded things in practical sequence, the way a ranger might document weather anomalies or equipment failure. 1978. Lights observed west of the line marker. No effect if unacknowledged. 1986. Auditory imitation began after prolonged tower shifts. 1997. First double reported by Perkins. Not believed. Perkins is missing within the week. 2008. Radio now functional during power outages. Correlation with rainfall uncertain. 2014. Rules revised again. Earlier versions no longer protective. Then, later, in entries that grew shorter and more crowded, it changes with observation, not random, responsive. We are not containing it, we are training around it. Each rule is a negotiation that eventually expires. That sentence I copied onto my palm because I needed to feel its shape physically. The final pages of his journal were the only ones that sounded tired. It's learning faster now, and beneath that, if Ethan comes, he will think this is superstition. He'll have reason. So did I. Keep records anyway. Records outlast confidence. I had to set the journal down then, because a specific kind of guilt began working on me. Not guilty about the cabin. About everything else. The forged credentials, the consulting reports I'd signed, the safety data I'd altered because a client wanted a cleaner audit, and I wanted the money. I had told myself no one was truly hurt, that it was administrative fraud, not blood. But sitting underground with the accumulated testimony of people who had spent generations trying and failing to define a danger, I understood something ugly about myself. I had come here because I was practiced at dismissing warnings that complicated my plans. When I came up from the shelter, Claire was standing in the yard. I nearly fired at her. She held both hands away from her body to show they were empty. Her jacket was dry this time. In daylight, she looked younger than I'd thought, though that may have been exhaustion misread as age the day before. "You found the archive," she said. I said nothing. "Then you know the typed list in the cabin isn't the whole thing. Who are you really?" She gave a small, humorless smile. "That depends on which version of this place you're standing in." I hated that answer on sight. It sounded rehearsed, like language designed to profit from my fear. Yet I did not order her off the property. That was the first sign I had crossed from contempt into need. She reached slowly into her pocket and produced a folded, oil-stained card. "My rules," she said, "not yours." I did not take it from her, she read instead. "The radio is the only thing here that sometimes tries to help. The tower is safe if you enter it on purpose. The shelter is where it stores leftovers." "That's convenient," I said, "since all three are the opposite of what I got." "Your grandfather fed it patterns," she said flatly. "Routine, obedience. Successive caretakers teach the same responses to the same signals until the thing learns how to wear them. Maybe he thought he was buying time. Or maybe you're lying." She looked past me toward the tower. Of course I might be. That was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in days. Rain began again in a fine cold mist. Neither of us moved. "Did you knock on my door yesterday?" I asked. "Yes." "How did a notebook predict you?" Her face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because it was written after it happened." "That doesn't answer anything." "No," she said, "it doesn't." Then she took one slow step backward. "If you hear your own voice outside tonight," she said, "don't assume it wants the same thing you do." She turned and walked toward the tree line without waiting to see whether I followed. I didn't, but I watched until the forest took her, and I could not decide which possibility frightened me more, that she was real, or that the cabin had learned a new way to speak. Once you accept that the instructions keeping you alive may also be teaching the thing hunting you, obedience becomes its own kind of suicide. That realization did not arrive heroically. It arrived because I noticed the activity around the cabin intensified whenever I behaved predictably. If I slept in the same room twice, I woke to footsteps outside the door. If I took the same path from the cabin to shed, I glimpsed movement pacing me in the trees. If I ate at the table at the same hour, the radio clicked on within minutes, as if keeping appointment. The first time I deliberately broke my own routine, the pressure eased. I fell asleep in the equipment shed, sitting upright against a crate, and woke untouched. The next day, I crossed the property in crooked, pointless loops and saw nothing watching me until dusk. I started making rules of a different kind, not commandments to obey, but habits to avoid. I wrote them on the back of a fuel invoice and kept the paper in my breast pocket. Never sleep in the same room twice. Never follow sounds. Never use the same path through the property. Never respond honestly when spoken to. If forced to choose, choose the option that feels less like a story. That last one sounds absurd, but by then the story itself had become a danger. The cabin seemed to reward narrative, cause and consequence, pattern and repetition. If something invited interpretation too neatly, I learned to distrust it. Claire returned near sunset carrying a flashlight, a rolled survey map, and an expression of someone who had decided cooperation was distasteful but necessary. "I can stay outside if you prefer," she said. I did prefer. I let her in anyway. We spoke in the main room with both of us standing, neither wanting the vulnerability of sitting first. She said, a contract surveyor who had been mapping erosion lines after a wildfire season 2 counties west. She had heard of the Mercer cabin from an older ranger who told her the roads around it misbehaved after heavy storms. She had come looking for a place that might still have radio equipment after her truck disappeared from a route she swore she'd driven twice before. That story could have been true. It also had the polished shape of a lie pre-built to survive questions. "What's on your list?" I asked. She unfolded her card and set it on the table between us, but kept her fingers on the edge. Her rules were handwritten, not typed. Trust the first voice only. The radio lies less than the windows. The tower shows what belongs here. Do not stay underground when thunder is distant. If someone arrives dry during rain, do not let them use your name. "You see the problem," she said. "I see several. You think your grandfather was protecting you because he was family. I think everybody here had partial information. She studied me a little too long, and I think you already know what it does with certainty." The radio clicked on behind us. Neither of us moved. Static flooded the room. Then a weather band. Then a man's voice I recognized as my grandfather's, though I had not heard it in years outside memory. "Tower now." Claire's jaw tightened. "Don't. You said trust the radio." I said, "Trust the first voice only." "That's not a first voice. It's a selected one." "Selected by what?" "By whichever version of you it thinks is listening." I hated how plausible that sounded. The voice came again, still in Silas's tone but with a faint drag under the words like tape stretched too often. "Ethan, don't let Claire in the shelter." Claire did not look at me. I've heard that exact sentence with different names substituted. Meaning what? Meaning it triangulates. The lights flickered. Wind struck the cabin in a hard blow. Somewhere outside, Metal slammed. Maybe the shed door, maybe the lookout gate, maybe something else. I found that my hand had drifted to the rifle leaning near the stove. Claire saw it and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a predictable weakness in me. "Go ahead," she said. "You've already run the numbers." That sentence landed because it was true in a way I disliked. My whole adult life had been built on risk calculation, masquerading as professionalism. What's the chance this report is audited? What's the chance anyone gets hurt? What's the chance I'm the one blamed? Standing there with the radio murmuring my grandfather's voice and a stranger whose story might have been fabricated from my fear, I realized I was doing the same math again. Not who is innocent, who is useful, who is dangerous. Who do I sacrifice first if the equation goes bad? "I'm not going to shoot you," I said. "You weren't going to answer the door either." Thunder rolled, still distant. Claire reached into her bag so quickly, I jerked the rifle up. She froze, then slowly withdrew a second notebook, damp around the edges. "This is why I came back," she said. The cover was black, my stomach clenched. She opened it and turned it so I could see. The handwriting inside was mine again. Not similar, mine. One line had been boxed heavily. "When Claire arrives, do not let her leave until she tells you what she remembers from the 6th floor." I looked up. "The tower has 4 floors, I said. Claire's face changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition of a word she did not want spoken. "Sometimes," she said. The thunder came closer, and for the first time since inheriting the cabin, I understood that I was no longer trying to decide whether the rules were real. I was trying to decide which impossible thing wanted me alive longest. Time equals 1.0s. The storm that night did not behave like weather. It behaved like revision. At first, the changes were small enough to invite argument with myself. A hallway that seemed longer on the walk back than on the walk out. A window where there should have been a blank wall. The equipment shed appeared 10 yards farther downslope than it had at dusk. I told myself this was stress, perspective, darkness, the cheap tricks a frightened brain plays with familiar geometry. Then Claire opened the tower door and said, very softly, "This wasn't here before." She was standing on the landing between the 3rd and 4th levels. Above her, another flight of stairs rose into darkness. There had never been another flight. I climbed halfway and stopped, because I knew the tower's interior. I knew its measurements. The room at the top should have been directly over my head, my AP desk, and my cot, and all. Instead, there was space above it, vertical and patient. "Don't go up," Claire said. "You told me the tower was safe." "I told you it shows what belongs here." "That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it isn't." From below us, the radio in the main cabin began to speak through walls and rain. Not one voice, several, mine among them. I backed down the stairs. By then, the property had begun shedding consistency in broader strokes. Trails behind the cabin doubled back into stands of timber that had not existed that morning. The fire lookout platform overlooked a shallow ravine where yesterday there had been a slope. The north side of the clearing held 3 different arrangements of stumps, depending on which window I checked. Once, looking toward the storm shelter, I saw 2 hatches side by side for a blink. One rusted, one freshly painted green. Claire remembered conversations we had not had. "You asked me this already," she said when I demanded again to know how long she'd been near the property. "No, I didn't." "You did. In the shed. Or somewhere shaped like the shed. That doesn't mean anything." Her mouth twitched in something close to pity. "It means the place is keeping drafts." That phrase returned me to my grandfather's journals. Returns. Remainders. Leftovers. I had thought those were names for mimics, doubles, ghosts of missing people. I was wrong by scale. The cabin was not merely reproducing bodies or voices. It was collecting discarded versions of events, the almosts, the near misses, the roads not taken, the survivors who had turned left instead of right, and thereby ended in a different sequence. We were standing in a junction of failed possibilities. The figure at the trees came for me just before dawn. Rain had weakened to mist. The clearing held that pre-morning gray that flattens depth and makes every object appear cut from damp paper. I was on the porch because I no longer trusted windows to give a stable account of the outside world. Claire slept, or pretended to, in the main room with the rifle across her knees. I saw him at the edge of the clearing by the old marker post. At first, I thought it was a reflection. Then he took one step forward into better light. He was me. Not a perfect copy in the clean, supernatural sense. He was older than I was by maybe 10 years. Thinner, beard gone gray at the chin, lines cut hard around the mouth. His jacket was one I did not own, forest green with a torn shoulder patch. He carried himself with the wary economy of someone who had been afraid for a very long time, and learned not to spend motion carelessly. He stopped where the mud began. "I wouldn't come closer," he said. His voice was mine after a bad winter. I did not answer. "Good," he said. "Lying helps," I asked. "What are you?" He tilted his head, as if the question were childish. "What you become, if you survive by understanding, instead of escaping." The mist drifted between us. He kept his hands visible, fingers spread slightly away from his sides. Not a threat posture, not friendly either. "Claire?" I asked. "She's real often enough to matter. That doesn't mean anything. It means you should stop hoping for clean categories." I wanted to shoot him, not because I thought it would solve anything, but because the sight of my own face carrying information I did not have felt like a private humiliation sharpened into hatred. "What is this place?" I said. He looked past me toward the tower. "A recruitment problem," he said. "At first it imitated people. Then it learned routines. Then it learned how to keep the most useful versions. Every watcher leaves residue. Every survivor leaves instructions. Some of those instructions harden into rules. Some of those people harden into voices. After long enough, the difference disappears. You expect me to believe I become part of it. I expect you to recognize how much you already like being the man who writes the next explanation." That struck too close. He saw it. "The rules were never protection," he said. "They were evidence. Traces of failed negotiations, written by people too afraid to admit there may be nothing here to bargain with." Behind me, the radio came alive with a burst of static. Claire shouted my name from inside, but it sounded wrong, as if spoken through another memory. The older version of me took one step back toward the trees. "Listen carefully," he said. "It doesn't want bodies. Bodies are easy. It wants replacements. Witnesses who will stay long enough to translate it badly. Why tell me any of this?" His expression altered, and for the first time, I saw genuine exhaustion in him. Because once I didn't, then he was gone. Not vanished theatrically, just no longer where mist and trees said he should be. When I went back inside, Claire was standing over the radio with both hands pressed to the table, as though bracing against acceleration. "What happened?" she demanded. "Nothing useful. That means something useful did." I looked at her and understood, with a sick clarity, that the threat had evolved beyond the rules, because the rules themselves had become part of its ecology. Every attempt to survive it gave it more forms to wear, and dawn was still an hour away. The final night broke every remaining system at once. Until then, even terror had possessed a kind of grammar. See a sign, infer a cause, choose between contradictory instructions, accept the risk. But after the encounter with the older version of myself, the cabin stopped offering sequences. It gave simultaneous demands. The radio barked conflicting orders in overlapping voices. "Shelter now. Never shelter in thunder. Tower. Do not ascend. Answer the door. Do not let Ethan in." Journals left open on the table rewrote themselves as I watched, ink spreading across dry paper in fresh lines. that contradicted what had been there a minute earlier. Claire read one page aloud, only to have the sentence change under her finger. The hallway to the bunkroom shortened and lengthened between passes. At one point, I opened the pantry and found the storm shelter ladder descending where shelves of canned beans had been. Claire grabbed my wrist before I stepped through. "That one isn't yours," she said. "How can you tell?" "I don't know. I just can." We began fighting over instincts neither of us could justify. That, more than the voices or shifting walls, was what turned panic feral. Cooperation requires a shared reality. Without it, every suggestion sounds like manipulation. "Trust the first door you see," she said. "The first voice, you mean?" I said door. You said voice before. Then maybe that version of me was wrong. The lights died, returned, died again. Rain battered the roof, then ceased so abruptly that the silence rang. Somewhere in the main cabin, another pair of footsteps moved in perfect counterpoint to ours. Not echoing, answering. We ran without deciding to. Through the office, down a hall that now held 2 extra doors, across the enclosed passage to the tower, back out again when the tower stairwell opened onto black water instead of steps. I stopped consulting lists, stopped trying to optimize. Every time I reached for logic, the place seemed to get ahead of me, so I began doing the opposite of what made sense. I opened doors that felt wrong and ignored the ones that looked safe. I turned left, twice in a row, because a pattern wanted alternating choices. I answered voices with nonsense. When the radio used my own tone to say, "Basement now," I climbed onto the roof of the woodshed instead and dropped through the other side. When a hallway led neatly toward the storm shelter, I doubled back through a bathroom window and crawled through wet brush. The effect was immediate and obscene. The pressure changed, not lessened, changed. The place felt irritated. Signals repeated with less finesse. My grandfather's voice on the radio cracked into static mid-sentence. Knocking came too fast, no longer patient, as if whatever observed me had expected compliance and was now improvising badly. "It's losing the pattern," Claire said, panting beside me under the fire lookout platform. "Good." "No," she said. "I think it's losing patience." That was when I knew where I had to go. Not because a rule told me, because the older version of me had. The rules were evidence. The shelter archive wasn't a defense system. It was a storage organ, a record of every failed translation this place had accumulated and perhaps relied on. If the phenomenon used rules as scaffolding, then destroying the scaffolding might force it into raw behavior, or kill us. By then, the difference had narrowed. We reached the storm shelter through a route that should not have existed, between the equipment shed and a stand of cedar that had yesterday overlooked an open slope. The hatch stood open. No rain fell inside. Stale air breathed upward, carrying paper rot, oil, and something sweetly fungal beneath. Claire grabbed my arm. "If this is a trap, everything here is a trap. That isn't an answer. It's the only honest one I've got." Below, the concrete room was larger than before. Shelves rose higher than the ceiling should have allowed. Not dozens of notebooks, hundreds, thousands. Ranger logs, spiral pads, ledger books, typed binders, loose pages bundled with a string. A whole civilization of attempted understanding. The cold open I described at the beginning belongs here. I fed them to the steel drum with both hands, too fast to read anymore. Rules written by men named Perkins, Alvarez, Morrow, and Singh. Rules by women whose surnames had been scratched out. Rules by my grandfather. Rules in my own handwriting. Some pages fought the fire, curling away from it as though damp. Some went up instantly, edges burning blue. The radio on the workbench activated by itself and began cycling through voices with frantic speed. Silas, Claire, mine, a child's, a stranger's, then the older version of me. "Do not burn them," he said. Claire stood at the door with the rifle aimed upward toward the hatch, though I'm not sure at what. It's coming. The walls had started knocking from within them, not random impacts. A search pattern. Left wall, pause. Back wall, pause. Ceiling, pause. Learning the room by sound. "Help me," I said. She hesitated only a second, then began ripping journals from shelves and throwing them into the drum. Ink smoked bitterly. The room filled with gray coils that seemed to resist rising. I remember seeing one page half consumed, a sentence visible before it blackened. "If you inherit the cabin, do not." I threw it in before I could finish it. Above us, something hit the hatch hard enough to buckle it inward. Then the face appeared in the shelter door window. My face. Older, wet, ruined by exhaustion. He pressed his palm to the glass. "Too late," he mouthed. Maybe he meant the fire had already taught it enough. Maybe he meant escape had already split into versions, and I had chosen the wrong one. Maybe he was trying to frighten me into stopping, because he needed the archive intact to remain himself. I burned the last armful anyway. When the final stack caught, a sound moved through the shelter that I still cannot compare to anything human without lying. It was not a scream. It was a loss of composure at scale, as if 1,000 careful imitations had all slipped at once. The lights blew out. Claire shouted. I lunged for the ladder by instinct, not reason, climbing through heat and smoke toward the hatch, as the room behind us filled with the dry flutter of burning pages, and voices speaking over one another, in languages made entirely of instruction. I did not look back. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, I stopped trying to understand it. I ran. Morning did come. That sentence remains difficult for me to write, because part of me still believes dawn that day was simply another behavior the cabin had learned to imitate. But the facts I can verify are these. I woke in wet grass beside a service road that had not existed when I arrived. The sky was clear. The storm was gone. The forest was loud. Birdsong struck me first, not as comfort but as assault. Jays, thrushes, some chittering thing in the underbrush. Wind moving through leaves with ordinary complexity, instead of that hollow, empty surf sound the property had held all week. Insects lifted from the ditch when I moved. The world had resumed all the small biological noises I hadn't realized I had been starving for. I was alone. No sign of Claire, no sign of the cabin, no smoke on the ridgeline. The road beneath me was gravel, recently graded by the look of it, with tire marks and a county marker half a mile down. My truck sat exactly where it should have been parked on the first day, if any map had been honest. Keys in the ignition, duffel bag on the back seat, as though the intervening horror had been a detour reality forgot to log. I drove until I found cell service, and then kept driving. I did not call the police. I did not call the executor. I did not tell anyone a word about Silas Mercer's property. By the time I reached a motel near the interstate, I had already begun performing sanity for myself. Shower, shave, throw away the clothes that smelled of smoke and mildew, buy new ones, follow the news, answer no unknown numbers. The lawsuits were still there. My debts were still there. A former client had frozen an account I'd forgotten existed. Ordinary consequences resumed with almost insulting speed. Yet none of it felt as solid as the memory of that cabin. I found I could discuss accusations of fraud more calmly than I could hear rain on a motel window. Weeks passed, then months. I moved twice, used cash when I could, took temporary work under a shortened version of my name. I slept with lights on for a while, then with the television playing, then finally in silence, because artificial noise began to feel too much like a radio waiting to wake up. If I heard knocking after dark, I did not answer. That habit has not left me. I told myself the road existed because someone had cut it recently. I told myself Claire had escaped another way. I told myself that smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and pre-existing guilt could produce astonishing distortions. On my better days, I even believed some of that. Then the package arrived. No return address. Brown paper. Hand-delivered or mailed, I couldn't tell. It was waiting outside my apartment door on a Tuesday evening, dry despite steady rain. Inside was a fresh Ranger notebook. Not old, not mildewed, clean black cover. The kind that could be bought at any supply store in any town in the country. My name was not on it. I opened to the first page. The writing there was mine. I sat down on the floor immediately, because my knees had stopped working. The line read, "If you inherit the cabin, do not burn the notebooks." I do not know how long I stared at that sentence. Long enough for the rain outside to change rhythm. Long enough for my hands to leave damp marks on the paper. Then, while I watched, a second line appeared beneath the first. No visible pen, just ink spreading through fibers, as if the page were remembering rather than being written. That only works the first time. I closed the notebook and threw it across the room. It struck the wall and fell open near the radiator. I did not touch it again until the morning. There was one more thing inside. Tucked into the back cover was a photograph printed on matte paper, slightly blurred at the edges like an old surveillance shot. It showed the cabin from deep within the trees, main roof, tower, fire lookout platform. The angle was low, half hidden by branches, as if whoever took it had been watching for a long time before pressing the shutter. In the clearing, near the porch, stood a man. He was turned toward the camera. Even grainy and distant, I knew the set of his shoulders, the shape of his mouth, the way one hand hung lower because of an old wrist injury I got at 19 and never treated properly. It was me, not the older, ruined version from the storm shelter window. Me as I am now, or near enough, standing outside the cabin, watching the photographer. I have considered every explanation that lets the world remain tolerable. The image was manipulated, that someone followed me, researched me, learned enough to counterfeit my handwriting, and stage a cruelty elaborate enough to break me. That trauma has an afterimage, and I am feeding it with secrecy. Maybe. But there are nights when I wake before dawn and know, without evidence, that another version of my life is continuing somewhere the roads do not admit. In that version, I never left, or I left and returned, or I became the kind of man who waits at tree lines to study newcomers with his own face. I keep the notebook locked in a metal box I have never fully trusted. Sometimes I think I hear a page turn inside it. I have not opened it again. Not yet. Because if the cabin learned how to store people as instructions, and instructions as people, then maybe inheritance was never about land or blood at all. Maybe the next Mercer was just the easiest shape for the message to wear. And if that's true, the worst possibility is not that I failed to escape. It is what I did, and brought the last rule with me.